You'll often hear casters talk about win condition units. These are units which are essential to a build's working properly. And today we've got a very unorthodox build from Luthien, submitted obviously the Wood Elves here. He's got a Spell Weaver of Shadows, actually, an Umbral Pendulum, and the Withering up against the Skaven. We've also got two Forest Dragons, and on that note, we've got this Loex Blessing here to make those flying units invisible on the approach against some Skaven. Only a few skirmish cavalry here, some Glade Riders, Hawk Riders, two Hawk Riders, four Glade Riders, and a handful of Zoats and Spears chilling in the back. Against some Skaven, we've got Jezzails, Mortars, two Jezzails, a Mortar, Ikid Zap Zap, a whole bunch of Eshin Triads, a couple of Rat Ogres, Deathmaster Snitch leading the way, a Lore of Plague Priest. So as it pertains to win condition, I also want to talk about the concept of target priority, which is sort of related, right? The win condition, both for yourself and your opponent, again, is those units which are essential for your win, obviously. And in this case, it's definitely these two Forest Dragons as well as a Spell Weaver. I mean, your Lord's kind of always a win condition unit. Almost always, I should say. The Forest Dragons, though, being very expensive, powerful units, obviously, they are the win condition for Wood Elves here. Now, in analyzing the Skaven army, then you would say, okay, what threatens, if you're in the Wood Elves position here, what threatens my Forest Dragons the most? Obviously, the Jezzails and Ikid Zap Zap are going to be the primary threats. The Mortars are kind of a secondary threat, although they are very threatening for this Skirmish Cav force, which is pretty considerable as well. So I'm going to start with a nice Penumbral Pendulum, cutting through some of those Clan Rat Spears. But you can see the Bow Fire and Breath Attack right off the bat going in on those Natty Boobo's Sharpshooters. Kills a number of models there. And a quick dive by this dragon straight into Ikid Zap Zap here, not really caring too much about the Triads. There's no Warp Grinders or Howling Warp Gale to lock these flying units in place, and the splash attack of the dragon, you can see, easily destroys actual model artillery piece there, which is just awesome. The other dragon quickly charging along with the Spell Weaver into Natty Boobo's Sharpshooters, routing them off before the Skaven really have a chance to adequately respond here. Blade Riders also pull up and start shooting at said weapons teams, again, helping to get rid of them. They're going to take some pretty significant damage from those mortars, so definitely need to try and shut them down as soon as possible. The Skaven player deployed pretty close to the line here, which is going to work against them in that as their units get terrified and routed off, they're very likely to quickly run off the battlefield. Although Natty Boobo Sharpshooters just getting straight up shattered there. Nice Breath Attack comes in, actually destroys one or more of the artillery pieces of Ikid Zap Zap, as well as doing some nice damage to those Triads. Taking kind of a cinematic look here, you can see one of the units of Hawk Riders charged in initially to try and break this Jezzail, which was unsuccessful, but the other one just kind of hanging here up in the air, using their bows to go after this Poison Wind Mortar. That Withering could be used at this point to lower the armor of these Poison Wind Mortars, put them down to only 40 armor, which is a significant difference. And here that AoE is used actually on the Triads, but does end up hitting Poison Wind Mortars, which is quite nice. So with the three weapons teams gone, and Ikid Zap Zap shortly to be eaten by this Blade Dragon here. Absolutely brutal splash attack there. Other Blade Dragon charges down to distract these Rat Ogres, and the Skaven are already having major terror issues. Triads are an interesting unit in this matchup. They are pretty squishy, especially to magic damage, and obviously all the Forest Spirit units, including these Forest Dragons, do deal magic damage. Did I say fire damage? I meant to say magic damage. Anyway, Plague Priest also has been getting sniped heavily by these Glade Riders and Hawk Riders, so he's pretty much done for, getting picked away now. And slowly but surely, this Skaven force is kind of piecemeal being picked apart. It's kind of an interesting battle. Some of you may not necessarily love this, but it's kind of how things go sometimes. And it is definitely smart play on the Wood Elf side from Luthien here, which is why I wanted to show you guys this, because this is a very classic, like, targeting the priority units, and doing that in a very appropriate way. These Jezzails are still hanging around, but at this point, down to half their unit models. They're the non-ROR Jezzails as well, so not likely to actually do that much damage. At the end of the day, the Zoats can now come forward. I believe the Spears are They're chilling in the woods. Who needs the spears? At this point, the Wood Elves are pretty heavily on the balance, ahead on the balance power anyway. Going to pop a nice little Flesh to Stone self-buff on these Zoats. They're going to turn around and start fighting Rat Ogres. Rat Ogres you would think would have some physical resistance, but in fact they do not. They're just going to get pounded there. And Forest Dragons likewise coming in to terrify away those last few crews and so forth. The weapons teams, that is, also fighting these Triads. You can see here the Triads, they do some okay damage, but also they're relatively squishy to something like the Forest Dragon, although trading reasonably cost effectively here, especially once the Rat Ogres can't come and lock it on the ground. You can see how the Forest Dragons are somewhat vulnerable. You do have to use them pretty carefully, but at this point, used up most of their breath attacks. Speaking of which, another beautiful breath right on the Triads, which is a great target for that as they're all clumped up especially. They just get wrecked. There isn't quite enough to terrify them away, unfortunately, even with the Withering also affecting their leadership. But at this point, Snitch is just very, very sad about everything, and is now involved in combat against these Zoats, who, again, magic attacks against Snitch is pretty good. I mean, they don't have the best stat profile to really be fighting him 30-40 versus 70-50, but, they might potentially get some hits in. And the Forest Dragon on a rear charge, obviously, will do some really nice damage, and probably terrify away the poor Rat Assassin, which will lead to army losses, I would imagine. Yep, everything starts shattering there, and it is over. So, well played to Luthien there, and Cinnamon Sam. Both, thanks for Luthien to sending that one in. Interesting Wood Elf build. Definitely very different what you would normally expect, although maybe not. Wood Elves can tend to play in this very, steppe, almost nomad style, of course, with extra dragons. I don't think Attila had dragons, but you never know. 117 kills, 1,500 damage value on this guy here. 45 kills, 1,795, almost 1,800 damage value there. 7,500 damage dealt overall. This one interesting. It did a little more damage overall, but I guess that's mostly against these chaff units here. Zoats deployed in the late game didn't really do a ton, but the skirmish cav force largely did pay for itself, just barely. Except for one of the Hawk Riders, and then also decent damage on the Spellweaver Lord of Shadows. The Skaven side is pretty rough all around. Snitch eventually did get some damage in, but these weapons teams definitely not doing what they needed to. Even though, they still generated some pretty good value, paying for themselves just barely there, and obviously mortars almost always pay for themselves, but Ikid Zap was very bad, as was the Natty Boobo Sharpshooters in terms of value. They did not get much value at all. Rat Ogres did okay. The Triads, though, I'm not the biggest fan. You can see one of them did actually manage to pay for themselves in terms of damage output. They're just a little bit squishy for my taste against Wood Elves. Even like Dryads will match up very well against these guys. But I tend not to take the Clan Eshin units, melee units that is, up against the Wood Elves myself. But that's a topic for another day. Anyway, just to kind of quickly finish up our discussion about priority targets and win condition units. So, just taking a build here, this is a Tomb King's build I've been kind of theory crafting with Foot Cetra. Yes, because Foot Cetra seems like he might be viable. Charge events against large, decent stat spread, still relatively expensive, but in this build, you have a few win condition units, right? Obviously, the Caskets one, relatively expensive, pretty powerful single model artillery piece, also gives me extra power reserves, extra magic to work with. Previous iteration of this build, I had also Hydra Titan, which, again, a very expensive unit, would be a win condition for me to try and protect this thing, keep it alive. As long as I can keep it alive until the late game, supposing my opponent doesn't actually have the tools to deal with it in the late game, can probably carry at that point for me. So I've got all three of these kind of infantry speed. This Tomb Prince is going to ride along, or rather walk along, and give Guardian to Cetra and himself, obviously. So these three can kind of support each other. In theory, it is a little bit lacking in mobility, so I would need to be careful of, say, Skirmish Cav or Archers. Like, I did play this build up against a patron of mine, actually, in a practice session. I may show you guys that game. It was a pretty good game, actually. But basically, my priority was with these guys to take out the threats to the Hydra Titan, right? Because that's my most expensive piece. Cetra on foot, and I was up against the High Elves, really didn't have that many threats directly to him, so it's not like I really need to worry about protecting him too much. The big kind of vulnerable piece because of the large hitbox size is Hydro Titan up against archers. My patron, my opponent, Anti-Mage, brought Plague of Rust and a whole bunch of High Elf archers, which is a great pick against Tomb Kings, and thus made this guy quite vulnerable. Obviously, with that Overcast Plague of Rust minus 60 armor down to only 40, Hydro Titan becomes much, much more vulnerable to standard High Elf archers. And he used them pretty well to the point where my casket was primarily focusing on his archers rather than his... he had the Regiment of Renown Dragon Princes. I'm just like telling you, spoiling the whole game basically at this point. Probably should just show you that one as well. But anyway, yeah, targeting the archers that would be going after the Hydro Titan here rather than the expensive cav, because I can have, you know, other means of dealing with them. It's... it worked out pretty well. You know, so basically what I'm trying to say is when you get into a battle, consider like what units are going to win you the game, and then what units in your opponent's army are most threatening to that unit, and then kind of take them out first, then move on down the line of targets. So hopefully you guys got something out of this. Enjoy this Tactics Tuesday. If you like this sort of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification, share with a friend, like it, all that jazz. Thanks again. See you next time.